Chicago in the 1920s and 1930s was the fastest growing municipality in all of North America. With this growth came multiple opportunities for new forms of crime and deviance. Particularly toward the end of the 1920s, Chicago became a hotbed for bootlegging, and with it, Prohibition-era gangs. One such gangster, Alphonse Gabriel Capone, or Al Capone, rose to notoriety following a series of violent interactions through the 1920s. He had recently moved to Chicago from New York, and while in Chicago, began to build his empire, which would be founded upon the illegal smuggling of alcohol into the United States. Needless to say, by the 1930s, Chicago was a violent city, and one that saw multiple different forms of violence and crime occurring throughout many of its neighborhoods. This inspired researchers at the University of Illinois to begin studying what was going on and looking for any trends or trajectories that they could identify that might help to reduce crime in certain neighborhoods that were particularly at risk. We now know this as the Environmental School of Criminology, and it was first identified by researchers Park and Burgess, who wrote about the concentric circle theory. The theory was later updated by Shaw and McKay, who took in additional considerations from researchers like Edwin Sutherland, suggesting that systemic criminal behavior was a function of multiple environmental indicators beyond the geography that had been originally identified as the sole source of crime by Parks and Burgess. Despite the efficacy of this theory, it remains critiqued to this day because it was an attempt to apply the ecological fallacy. That is, the authors, who had likely learned much of their criminological education under the positivistic school of thinking, suggested that this could be a solution for crime worldwide. Was it? Well, let's talk about that. Hi everyone, it's Professor Popham here for CC100. In today's quick video, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about something called the ecological fallacy. Now, you may recall this from your lesson, or from some of your readings, as being one of the integral parts of something that we consider to be good theory. Some of the other components of good theory include testability. So that is, are we testing a concept that we can actually evaluate using different research methods? Second is applicability. That means, are the questions that we're asking actually applicable to the concept that we're studying? Third is operationalizability. That is, can we actually effectively test what we want to test? And finally, we come back to the ecological fallacy. Are we trying to come up with solutions that address an entire spectrum of people based on a small sample of data? Or are we being a little bit more conservative in our application of theory? This is a map of Chicago. Now, it's a modern map, but it still reflects the same ideas that you would have seen in Sean McKay's work 80 years ago. Crime most notably appeared down here in the lower part of the city. At the time, this would have been considered one of the transitionary zones where many newly landed immigrants would be arriving, finding cheap rent and opportunities for work. However, with those opportunities for work came less surveillance of young people and more opportunities for crime and engagement in gangs. Comparatively, here's a map of Toronto. You'll notice that there are some similarities here, particularly the fact that the city abuts a Great Lake. Additionally, we know that there are certain areas where there are higher crime rates in Toronto that roughly align with the transitionary zones, or have historically aligned with the transitionary zones that Shaw and McKay discussed. Next up, here's a map of Vancouver. Now, Vancouver is a little bit different than the cities of Toronto or Chicago because it is split in half by the Burrard Inlet as well as the harbour. Nonetheless, crime in the Greater Vancouver area tends to follow the same principles that were identified by Shaw and McKay, focusing on developing or inexpensive areas. Most notably, in the case of Vancouver, this would be Surrey, down to the bottom right. Shaw and McKay's theories start to fall apart when we look at hinterland cities. These are cities that are not affected by major bodies of water. For example, you're looking at the map of the city of Saskatoon here. If we were to apply the human ecological school in its original theory, it would have suspected that a natural growth around the city's core would lead to transitionary zones in a circle around the city. However, when we look at where crime actually plays out in Saskatoon, it's generally up in this area. Comparatively, other areas on the other side of the river are far less likely to experience high rates of violent crime or crimes with a high severity index. Finally, this last map is Thompson, Manitoba, which has the notoriety of being the most violent city in all of Canada. You'll note that there are no defining features of the city, and when we have a look at the crime rates, it's actually fairly evenly distributed all around. There are no enclaves of safety or of high violence. My point for showing you all these different maps was to identify how some of the assumptions underlying criminological theory might fall apart when we start to apply them in different areas that do not have the same sort of social or demographic characteristics as other cities or places where theories initially are developed. This doesn't mean that the ideas of people like Parks and Burgess or Shaw and Mackay were incorrect. What it does mean is that we must contextualize where this information is coming from and how it might influence the way it works in other regions. In other words, we cannot assume that there is an ecology of crime that can be easily identified from simplified and one-dimensional levels of analysis. Rather, we must think about crime and all of its multiple different influencing factors, which is what we're learning about in this class. Alright everybody, that's all I wanted to say about the concept of the ecological fallacy. I hope you found it interesting, and I'm looking forward to seeing you in class and hearing your thoughts. Until then, have a great day, and I'll see you soon. Thanks for watching.
This is America.